I want to put a great example of what the game is for the fans and the young people that come and watch. Like, I think that's really important, and I take that seriously. So hopefully we do that in a decent manner. I think we can continue to improve as we move.
Caitlin Clark just did something that has sent every NBA player, every league executive, every broadcast partner, and every institutional stakeholder in women's basketball into the kind of simultaneous eruption that only happens when someone uses a level of commercial and institutional power that nobody realized was available to do something that nobody realized was possible. She has reportedly chosen Adam Silver as the commissioner for a new era of women's basketball, and the specific nature of what that choice represents, the commercial leverage it reflects, the institutional realignment it proposes, and the challenge it poses to every existing governance structure in women's professional basketball, has the WNBA's current player population in a state of collective outrage that is as analytically significant as it is emotionally intense. Today, I am breaking down exactly what Clark's choice of Silver means in the specific institutional and commercial context of everything this season has produced, why WNBA players are specifically and collectively outraged rather than simply divided in their reactions, what the choice reveals about the specific commercial and institutional vision Clark has developed across the most consequential individual season any player has experienced in women's basketball history, and what it means for the future of women's basketball governance that the sport's most commercially significant player has made this specific institutional proposal at this specific moment. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific element of the Silver choice that explains why the player outrage is directed not just at the governance proposal itself, but at something deeper and more fundamental about what the choice communicates about Clark's vision for the institutional future of a sport that every player in this league has invested their careers in building. The relationship between Adam Silver, the NBA, and the WNBA's governance structure has been the subject of sustained and increasingly urgent conversation throughout the Clark era. As the commercial transformation that Clark has driven has created institutional conditions that the WNBA's existing governance framework was not designed to manage at the scale the transformation demands. Silver has been publicly supportive of women's basketball's growth throughout this period, has made institutional gestures toward greater NBA involvement in the WNBA's commercial development, and has been a visible and seemingly enthusiastic presence in the public narrative about the league's expansion. But as we documented in the video covering his brutal decision about Clark's situation, the formal boundaries of Silver's authority and the specific ways in which NBA institutional interests and WNBA institutional interests diverge when they are genuinely tested have revealed that the comfortable official narrative of NBA and WNBA institutional alignment is more complicated in practice than it appears in the public communications both institutions have preferred to deploy. Clark's reported choice of Silver as the commissioner for a new era of women's basketball must be understood against the full backdrop of that complicated institutional history, because what she is proposing is not simply a personnel change at the commissioner level, but a fundamental restructuring of the institutional relationship between the NBA's governance apparatus and the WNBA's governance structure that the choice of Silver specifically represents. The specific institutional vision that the Silver choice reflects is the most ambitious and the most consequential governance proposal that has ever been made in the context of women's basketball by any individual player or institutional actor, and the outrage of the WNBA's current player population in response to it is the institutional expression of a complex set of concerns that the dramatic framing of the headline does not begin to adequately capture. Let us start with what Clark's choice of Silver actually means institutionally, because the specific governance proposal it represents is the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the dramatic headline of the choice without adequately examining what the institutional structure the choice proposes would actually look like, and what the specific implications of that structure are for every player, every franchise, and every stakeholder in women's basketball. Choosing Adam Silver as the commissioner for a new era is not simply a personnel recommendation that Clark is making from a position of fan or supporter. It is a specific institutional proposal that reflects a particular vision of how women's basketball's governance should be structured in the commercial era that Clark's presence has created. The proposal that the Silver choice represents, at its most specific institutional level, is that the WNBA's governance should be brought into closer alignment with the NBA's institutional apparatus in a way that uses the NBA's commercial infrastructure, its broadcast relationships, its sponsor relationships, and its governance experience to support and amplify the commercial transformation of women's basketball that the Clark era has initiated. The specific appeal of Silver in this framework is not simply his personal capabilities as a commissioner, although those capabilities are genuinely significant and have been documented across his tenure at the NBA. It is the specific institutional relationships and the specific commercial infrastructure that Silver's position gives him access to, and that would be brought to bear on women's basketball governance if the structure the Silver choice proposes were actually implemented. But here is where the analysis needs to go beyond the institutional proposal itself, and into why the WNBA's current players are specifically outraged by it, rather than simply divided in their reactions. Now let us talk about the player outrage, because this is the analytically significant layer that the mainstream coverage is treating primarily as a dramatic reaction rather than examining the specific concerns it reflects and why those concerns are legitimate even in the context of Clark's specific institutional vision. The WNBA's current players are outraged by Clark's choice of Silver for reasons that are more specific and more substantive than simple opposition to any change in the existing governance structure. The specific concerns that the outrage is expressing fall into several distinct categories that each reflect genuine and legitimate institutional interests that the player population has a right to advocate for, regardless of how commercially significant the player making the governance proposal is. The first concern is about institutional independence. The WNBA's development as a commercially independent institution with governance authority that reflects the specific interests of women's basketball rather than the institutional priorities of the NBA has been one of the most important organizational achievements of the league's recent history. And many current players assess that bringing Silver into the governance structure in the form the Clark choice proposes would compromise that independence in ways that ultimately serve NBA institutional interests rather than WNBA player interests when those interests diverge. The second concern is about collective bargaining authority. The specific governance structure the Silver choice proposes has implications for the collective bargaining relationship between the Players Association and the league's governance apparatus that the player population has not been consulted about, and that could affect the specific rights and protections the collective bargaining agreement provides, in ways that a player of Clark's commercial standing might be less directly affected by than players whose commercial situations are less independently powerful. The third concern is about representation. A governance structure that elevates Silver to the commissioner role for a new era of women's basketball was not proposed through any process that included the player population's collective input, and the specific way the proposal was made, through Clark's individual commercial power rather than through any form of collective player governance consultation, raises legitimate questions about whose interest the proposal is designed to serve and whose institutional voice it reflects. These concerns are real, they are substantive, and the outrage that reflects them is not simply the emotional reaction of players resistant to change, but the legitimate institutional response of a player population whose collective interests in the governance of their own professional league have not been adequately consulted in the formation of the most significant governance proposal the Clark era has produced. Now let us talk about what the specific player outrage tells you about the broader institutional tension between Clark's individual commercial power and the collective commercial and governance interests of the WNBA's player population. Because this is the deepest and most analytically significant layer of the entire story. Clark's commercial position in the WNBA is genuinely unprecedented. The $3 billion commercial ecosystem, the Jordan brand, the NBC relationship, the institutional leverage that her commercial position provides in relation to the league's governance apparatus, all of these things together give her a level of individual institutional power in the governance of this league that no previous player in women's basketball has possessed and that the existing governance frameworks were not designed to accommodate. When that individual commercial power is used to make a governance proposal of the magnitude of the Silver choice, without consultation with the collective player population whose professional lives the governance structure governs, it creates a specific institutional tension between Clark's individual commercial authority and the collective governance rights of the player population that the outrage is expressing. The WNBA's players are not outraged because they oppose good governance or because they lack Clark's commercial sophistication about what the league's institutional future should look like. They are outraged because the specific form of the governance proposal reflects an exercise of individual commercial power that bypasses the collective governance processes through which the player population has a legitimate right to participate in decisions about the institutional structure of the league they compete in. And that bypassing is experienced as the most direct available expression of the gap between Clark's individual institutional position and the collective institutional interests of the players whose commercial futures are less independently powerful than hers. Think about what it means to be a WNBA player whose commercial situation does not provide the kind of individual institutional leverage that Clark's provides, and to watch the governance structure of the league you compete in be proposed for fundamental restructuring through an individual choice made by the most commercially powerful player in the league's history, without any collective consultation process. That is not simply a governance disagreement. It is an institutional experience of what the gap between individual commercial power and collective governance rights looks like when it operates at the scale the Clark era has created. Now let us zoom all the way out, because Clark's choice of Silver as commissioner for a new era is not simply a WNBA governance story or a player outrage story. It is the most concentrated and the most institutionally revealing expression yet of the fundamental governance challenge that the commercial transformation of the Clark era has created for women's basketball. The governance challenge at its core is this: the Clark era has created individual commercial power in the hands of one player that is large enough to make institutionally consequential governance proposals with real commercial leverage behind them. The existing governance frameworks of the WNBA were designed for a commercial environment in which individual player commercial power was insufficient to create this kind of individual institutional leverage in governance conversations. The gap between the commercial reality the Clark era has created and the governance frameworks designed for the commercial reality that preceded it is the structural source of the tension that Clark's Silver choice has brought into its most public and most concentrated expression. The player outrage is the most immediate and most visible expression of that tension, but the tension itself runs through every institutional relationship in the WNBA's governance structure and will require deliberate and collective institutional work to resolve in a way that serves both the commercial transformation the Clark era has made possible and the collective governance rights of the player population whose professional lives the governance structure is responsible for serving. Remember that specific element I mentioned at the start that explains the player outrage at a deeper level than the governance proposal itself? Here it is. The specific element of the Silver choice that the player outrage is most fundamentally responding to is not the proposal that Silver should be commissioner, but the specific process by which the proposal was made, through individual commercial leverage rather than collective governance consultation, and what that process reveals about the institutional vision for how governance decisions in the new era of women's basketball will be made, and whose individual or collective authority they will ultimately reflect. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the player outrage over Clark's Silver choice, and why it matters beyond the immediate dramatic reaction it has generated. The specific collective bargaining implications of the Silver choice and the governance structure it proposes are the most practically significant and the most immediately consequential element of the player outrage that the mainstream coverage is not examining with adequate depth. The collective bargaining agreement between the WNBA's Players Association and the league's governance structure governs every specific right and protection that players receive in the conduct of their professional lives, from minimum salaries to playing conditions to medical protections to the specific rules that govern how trades, free agency, and roster decisions are made. Any change in the governance structure of the league that alters the institutional identity of the entity the Players Association is bargaining with has direct and potentially significant implications for the collective bargaining relationship, and those implications are what the player population most directly affected by the collective bargaining outcomes is most urgently concerned about when they encounter a governance proposal of the magnitude of the Silver choice without having been consulted about it. The second hidden angle is the specific commercial implications of the Silver choice for the players whose commercial situations are most different from Clark's. The commercial infrastructure and the institutional relationships that the Silver Choice proposes to bring into women's basketball governance would benefit the commercial development of players across the WNBA, but the specific way those benefits would be distributed across the player population is not neutral. Players with the commercial profile and the commercial independence to take full advantage of the NBA's commercial infrastructure would benefit more directly and more immediately than players whose commercial situations require the protection of collective bargaining provisions that the existing governance structure provides, and that the proposed new structure might affect in ways that a commercially independent player of Clark's standing would be less directly vulnerable to. My verdict on Clark's Silver Choice and the player outrage it has generated is this, stated directly. Caitlin Clark choosing Adam Silver as commissioner for a new era of women's basketball is the most institutionally ambitious governance proposal that has ever been made in this sport by any individual player, and it reflects a genuine commercial vision for the institutional future of women's basketball that deserves serious analytical engagement rather than reflexive opposition. But it also reflects an exercise of individual commercial power in the governance domain that bypasses the collective consultation processes through which the player population has a legitimate right to participate in the most significant governance decisions of the new era. And the player outrage in response to it is the legitimate institutional expression of that bypassing, rather than simply the emotional reaction of players resistant to change. The first reason this verdict is correct is the commercial vision. The institutional vision the Silver Choice reflects is one that recognizes the commercial transformation of the Clark era and proposes a governance structure with the institutional resources and relationships to support that transformation at the scale it demands, and that commercial vision deserves genuine engagement rather than reflexive rejection on the basis of institutional inertia. The second reason is the process failure. However compelling the commercial vision the Silver Choice reflects, the process by which it was proposed, through individual commercial leverage without collective consultation, creates legitimate institutional concerns about whose interests the proposed new governance structure is designed to serve and whose voice it ultimately reflects that the substantive merits of the commercial vision cannot resolve. The third reason is the collective bargaining stakes. The specific implications of the proposed governance change for the collective bargaining relationship between the Players Association and the league's governance apparatus are the most practically consequential element of the player outrage, and they deserve the most serious institutional engagement from every stakeholder involved in the governance discussion the Silver Choice has initiated. The strongest counter-argument is that Clark's commercial standing gives her a unique and legitimate perspective on what the WNBA's governance requires for the commercial era her presence has created, and that the player outrage reflects an institutional conservatism that ultimately serves the interests of the people most resistant to the change the league needs, rather than the interests of the player population as a whole. That argument has genuine merit as a critique of institutional conservatism. The counter to the counter is that the distinction between institutional conservatism and legitimate collective governance rights is a distinction that the process through which the Silver Choice was made has not respected, and the player outrage is as much about the process as it is about the proposal, which means addressing the substantive merits of the Silver Choice without addressing the process concerns the outrage reflects would leave the most fundamental institutional tension in the Clark era's governance challenge unresolved. So tell me in the comments right now, do you think Clark's choice of Silver as commissioner represents the right commercial vision for women's basketball's institutional future? And do you think the process by which she proposed it respects the collective governance rights of the player population whose professional lives the governance structure is responsible for serving? Drop both answers, because this question is the most important institutional governance question in the history of women's basketball, and I want to know exactly where this audience stands on both of its dimensions. Here are my 3 predictions. First prediction: the WNBA Players Association issues a formal collective response to Clark's Silver Choice within 1 week that neither accepts nor rejects the governance proposal, but specifically demands a formal collective consultation process through which the player population can engage with the proposal's institutional implications before any governance change is implemented, establishing the Players Association's collective governance authority in the most visible and most consequential form it has taken in this league's history. High confidence because the specific nature of the player outrage and the specific institutional concerns it is expressing create an organizational imperative for the Players Association to formally assert the collective governance rights that the Silver Choices process has bypassed, and that formal assertion is the minimum institutional response that the player population's legitimate governance interests require. Second prediction. Adam Silver makes a public statement about Clark's proposal within 72 hours that neither accepts nor declines the commissioner's suggestion, but specifically acknowledges the institutional seriousness of what Clark is proposing, and commits to a formal engagement with the governance questions it raises, in a way that respects both the commercial vision the proposal reflects and the collective governance rights of the player population whose outrage the proposal has generated. Medium confidence, because Silver's institutional response to this specific kind of governance proposal, which simultaneously flatters his institutional standing and creates complex governance complications for his relationship with both the NBA and the WNBA, is genuinely uncertain and depends on institutional assessments that his advisors are currently making under significant public pressure. Third prediction, and this is the bold one, the governance conversation that Clark's Silver Choice has initiated produces the most significant formal reform of the WNBA's institutional governance structure in the league's history within the next 18 months. Not through the specific Silver Choice as it was proposed, but through a reformed process that includes collective player consultation, ownership engagement, and formal institutional design work that uses the commercial vision the Silver Choice reflects as its starting point, while building the collective governance legitimacy that the Choices process failed to establish. Low confidence on the specific timeline and the specific form of the governance reform, because institutional changes of this magnitude require collective processes that move at their own pace, but the specific institutional conditions the Silver Choice has created by simultaneously establishing the commercial ambition for what women's basketball governance could become and the process legitimacy concerns that the current proposal must address, are the conditions most favorable to exactly the kind of significant institutional governance reform this prediction describes. Remember that process element detail? The specific reason the player outrage is directed at something deeper than the governance proposal itself is the bypassing of collective consultation that the proposal's process represents, and resolving the outrage while preserving the commercial vision requires a reformed process that the current proposal has not yet provided. Watch for three things specifically going forward. First, track the Players Association's formal communications about the Silver Choice, and specifically, whether the formal response focuses primarily on the substance of the governance proposal or primarily on the process through which it was made. Because the specific emphasis of the formal response will tell you whether the player population's most urgent concern is with Silver as commissioner specifically, or with the individual commercial power bypass of collective governance consultation that the Choices process represents. Second, watch Silver's own institutional communications about the proposal, and specifically whether he engages with the governance proposal's substantive merits, or with the process concerns the player outrage has raised. Because the specific emphasis of his engagement will tell you whether the NBA's institutional apparatus is assessing the Silver Choice primarily as a commercial opportunity or primarily as a governance complexity that requires careful navigation. Third, watch Clark's own communication about the player outrage, and specifically, whether she addresses the collective governance concerns that the outrage is expressing or maintains the individual commercial vision that produced the Silver Choice in the first place. Because the specific form of her engagement with the player community's concerns will tell you whether the institutional vision she is proposing for women's basketball's new era has room for the collective governance consultation that the player population's outrage is demanding. In my next video, I am going deep on what a genuinely legitimate and genuinely comprehensive governance reform process for the WNBA in the Clark era would need to look like. One that captures the commercial vision the Silver Choice reflects while establishing the collective governance legitimacy that makes the institutional transformation sustainable and genuinely representative of the interests of every player whose professional life the governance structure is responsible for serving. The single most important thing WNBA players being outraged at Clark's choice of Adam Silver as commissioner for a new era tells us is that the commercial transformation of women's basketball has created individual institutional power in the hands of one player that is large enough to make governance proposals of genuine institutional consequence, and that the governance challenge this creates for the sport's institutional future requires a process that captures the commercial ambition of what that individual power is proposing, while establishing the collective governance legitimacy that makes the resulting institutional change genuinely representative of the interests of every player in the league, rather than simply the interests of the player whose commercial power made the proposal possible. Subscribe for the coverage that takes both the commercial vision and the collective governance rights of this league's players seriously, and holds every institutional actor to the standard of serving both, rather than choosing between them. And tell me in the comments, do you think the WNBA should bring Adam Silver in as commissioner